he were to go for some kind of full-scale invasion, he's basically gambling not just with his legacy, but with everything that the party has achieved since the death of Mao.
Jon Czin spent a long time on the analytical side of the CIA, served in Biden's NSC for a spell as a China director, and has made it out in one piece now at the Brookings Institution. We're going to talk PLA purges, Xi's fourth term, Taiwan, and many other things. Jon, welcome to China Talk.
Good to see you, Jordan. Thanks for having me on board.
All right, Jon, let's start with the PLA. You have this remarkable line in one of your pieces that Xi has now purged more members of the Central Military Commission than Mao ever did. What are we to make of this?
Yeah, and it's a little bit of, to use George W. Bush's term, fuzzy math, right? It depends on how you count, and we spent a lot of time looking on this. But I think he's on pace right now to have numbers that are comparable, right? And as a lot of people have commented, I mean, half of the uniformed members of the PLA are removed or missing. And so it was interesting this summer because every summer you kind of get this germination of rumors about Xi's health or the possibility of a coup or something along those lines. And I felt like it was even more intense this summer, in part because there were so many purges in the PLA. But and I think some people saw that as a potential sign of weakness. And there was this argument floating around that this reflected that Xi was somehow losing his grip on the military. But I think, as we make clear in the piece, I was skeptical of that argument, right? And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that from practically day one in Xi's tenure in office, he has been laser focused on ensuring that the PLA is under his thumb, right? And the anti-corruption campaign has been an important tool of it. I think there's genuine reasons he wants to pursue anti-corruption, but there's an important instrumental purpose, right? That is the key lever of power. And it's been very clear from the outset that he wants to suborn them to himself. The second aspect of it that I get added in a separate piece is it's also a question of who's been purged from the PLA so far. And, kind of my very rough heuristic for understanding the people in Xi's network is that it's kind of a two-tiered structure, right? Or if Xi is the center of his own political solar system, there's two echelons to it, right? There are the people who are inside the asteroid belt, and I would include most of the Politburo Standing Committee in that, right? And on the military side, I would include people like Zhang Youxiao, where it's not just a question of them having crossed paths in their career. There's an affinity that goes all the way back to their fathers, who both served in the 4th Field Army in China's Civil War together, right? And you see that in Joseph Turigian's excellent biography of Xi Zhongxun. And then I think for these other characters that have been removed, like Li Shangfu, the former defense minister, or even He Weidong, yeah, there might be some personal nexus. Maybe these guys cross paths. There's this school of thought out there that if you were in the 31st Group Army in what used to be the Nanjing military region and you cross paths with Xi, that could accelerate your career. But I think from my perspective, these guys are disposable. Xi can make them and he can break them. And I think that his ability to do that only enhances his authority rather than diminishes it. So I think that is part of what's going on here.
So, this thing you allude to of the generals being disposable was not a thing really for most of Chinese history. I mean, a lot of the generals, like generals had a ton of staying power in Mao's China. But fascinatingly, like instead of doing the sort of like pussyfooting around with purges in the PLA that you saw post-Mao, as you very colorfully pointed, he went after the monkeys instead of the chickens in his first few years. So how does that kind of reform push talk to his broader priorities, and then the fact that we're still seeing this stuff 15 years later?
Yeah, I think it's twofold, especially in those early days. And I think the first part of it is that I think when Xi got back to Beijing, keep in mind it was the first time he was back in Beijing since serving as the Minister of National Defense Geng Biao's Mishu back in the early 80s. I think he was frankly appalled with what he saw, with the extent of corruption inside the PLA. And I think that what happened during the Arab Spring only accentuated that anxiety, that there was corruption that was rife. We saw eventually with the Shu Cai-ho case that there was pay for promotion. This is not how you build a competent organization, right? If people are getting promoted because they're greasing people. So I think that's very much a real concern for him. I also think that part of Xi's heritage as a princeling is that he understands how important and central the PLA is to political power, right? So It's the opposite of the approach that I think we saw previous Chinese leader take, especially in the post-Deng era, where the military was, because of its insularity, was the last place where they were able to shore up their political position. She said, this is going to be the place that I start, because if I can, it's high risk, but it's high reward. If I can figure this out, I will dominate the system because I will have suborned the PLA to my will. So that's the second reason. And I think the third reason, and this is, again, this is less instrumental and more about policy, I think that the PLA reforms that we saw in that 2015-2016 period, I think those were really a centerpiece of Xi's reform agenda, such as it is. And I think there's a tendency to think that, especially in the post-Mao era, that economic reforms are really the locus of where senior leaders have wanted to focus their political firepower. But I think for Xi, I think it was really those military reforms. That the system was overdue for a correction, right? They had a very antiquated command structure, and it had only become more cumbersome over time. So again, it's tied in with those concerns about getting it under his thumb. But I think there's also a real substantive policy reason why he wanted to do it. And it also has a compounding effect too, because the fact that he was able to shake up the high command and streamline it only further enhanced his authority and power over it.
Yeah. So once you're the king, you can mess with these, these like poor little nobles all you want, because like, look, at the end of the day, it's your kingdom, and being able to establish that as early as he did seems to be more reflective than like, he's worried about a internal coup or something.
Exactly. And by going after Xu Caiho and Guo Boxiang, the guys who would have chomped on every general officer promotion, again, it's very risky. I mean, like for that system, it's like going after made men and living to tell about it, right? To keep using the mafia analogy. But I think there's a lot of truth to that. And what it is it's kind of a decapitation move. You're going to cut off the head of the network instead of the usual approach of nibbling around the edges and going after people's pawns or proteges on this political chessboard. And by doing that, you send a powerful signal to everybody else in the PLA to be on notice, because they all would have owed their promotions at some level to Xu Caiho, even if they didn't have a direct nexus with him. So that instantly, by just being able to do that and do it with impunity, that has got to terrify people and give Xi a lot of wasta inside the system.
Yeah, I want to come back to this sort of 2011, 2012, 2013. Mm-hmm. Are you more scared of the sort of Arab Spring, like the PLA did not jump to attention in 1989, and that story playing out? Or are you more scared of generals not liking the way you're treating them and their subordinates and their sort of bureaucracies, and being worried about kind of like the internal upbringing coup thing? Because it's clear that, Xi chose route A instead of route B. But, that wasn't necessarily, well, I'm curious to what extent you think that was a choice that was kind of baked in, or something that came from his personal background, or just a sign of the times in that moment. Maybe it's more just like, maybe it comes back to a broader question of like, to what extent was, a centralizing leader in 2012 something that the party was inevitably going to produce, versus, one who was going to continue to play by the Deng era rules.
Yeah. This is kind of the theory, like if Xi didn't exist, he would have to be invented, right? I tend to think that Xi did have an opportunity, right? I think there was a sense of malaise in the party at the end of the Hu Jintao era, right? That the leadership was adrift. And you had people even inside the system calling this a lost decade, and that Hu Jintao and Wen Xiaobao were basically living off borrowed time and the vigor and reform efforts of Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin from the previous administration. From my perspective, though, I think that it's not just that, right? Like that to pursue that line of thought is kind of to deny Xi his unique agency. And so from my perspective, I think there was an opening. I think there was an appetite for greater central control. There was a sense of drift in the party. But I think Xi took a crowbar to that opening.
Sure.
I don't think the people who backed him in the system necessarily thought that, they were going to be the ones who were going to end up hitting the head with the crowbar in some instances, right? And so I think that was always going to be his impulse. And I think part of the impulse inside the system too is that, power in that system tends to be monistic anyway. There's a tendency for it to centralize. And Alice Miller, citing Aristotle, has this great line about this in a very old issue of China Leadership Monitor from 20 years ago, where it talks about oligarchy. And oligarchies, going back to Aristotle, are subject to both centripetal forces and centrifugal forces. And the natural correction when you start to see this kind of drift, like we saw in the Hu Jintao era, is for the centripetal forces to kick back in and try to say, like, no, we need to get our act together, and we need a leader who can pull us together. But I think she was very adept in how they did this. And again, like, this has always been my mental model of how he operates and the way he was able to centralize control. I think of it as being like, because he's a princeling and he has these networks throughout the system that he was born with, I think of the way she approaches the political networks inside the CCP. It's like when an electrician comes to my house. If I took back the wall and I started messing around with the wires, or if a Hu Jintao started to do that, even though he's an engineer, I'd probably get electrocuted, right? But I think she knows which wires he can touch and which ones he can cut safely, and which ones are going to zap him.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the question is, like, were there ever any wires that could have zapped him at any point?
Mm-hmm. I think by going after, I think it was dangerous to go after people like Zhou Yongkang, Xu Caiho, Guo Boxiang. I mean, I think this is one of the things that looks obvious in retrospect, right? But at the time, if you're Xi Jinping and you're a brand new leader, just kind of getting up to speed, this is really dangerous. And there could have been some kind of meaningful backlash. I mean, I think part of the art of what he did is, maybe it made it a little bit easier by going after elders and people who had already retired from the system, and their links were somewhat attenuated at that point. But it could have also been a lot more, in some ways it also made it more gratuitous too, right? Like, I remember some people saying at the time, well, why would he go after these people? They're already retired. Why not just kind of neutralize them and let them die a quiet death or live a quiet retirement? But I mean, you're going after the guys in the system with the guns, right? I mean, it's just as simple as that. That's going to be challenging in that kind of system.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that he did so smartly is to do it right away.
Yep.
Because it's like like the idea of like the president's first 100 days or something. It's like you can undermine or wait out a guy who's got a year left, 2 years left, but 8 or 9.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, all right, for everyone else in the system who's seeing this battle, like, who are you going to side with, and what's the better bet? And if you don't have time on your side, and you see this like this actor who's moving with real agency, who's young and vigorous, and who just beat out other competitors, and like Bo is already, we already saw like Bo get put aside, right? So like his ability to sort of like push rivals into jails is something that has been demonstrated once in a very spectacular way, to bet against that. So for him not to like allow anyone to start complaining or like build up a rap sheet against him, for the first moves to be these anti-corruption moves, I think also probably really helped.
I think that's right. It was a blitzkrieg, number one, so speed was definitely one of his big advantages. And I think your point is very astute, right? That by going after the retired guys, if you're a mid-ranking officer or even a relatively senior officer, which horse are you going to back? The guy who just retired, or the guy who's going to be making all the decisions for the next 10? Now we're going into 20 years, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly right. It changes everybody else's calculus throughout the system.
Let's talk about the dynamics of Red versus Expert in the PLA, what she saw and how he's tried to shape it over the past 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely put more emphasis explicitly on the Red part of this, right? And if anything, I think what's really interesting is that, there's this casual notion that floats around sometimes that the PLA over the last 20 years or so has been professionalizing. And I talk about this in the piece, but I think that's kind of not quite right. I think there was maybe kind of an incipient tendency in that direction during the Hu Jintao era, just because they were becoming more proficient, they were modernizing. But I think from the party's perspective, they don't want a professional PLA in the sense that Samuel Huntington would have called this, right? That it's apolitical and politically neutral. And you can see that, on the pages of Jie Feng Junbao on a regular basis, right? Where she excoriates this idea and he reminds them, you are the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. That is mission number 1, 2, and 3. And you could even see that earlier in his tenure, right? You would see signs of a backlash against the idea of having a state military. And we wouldn't see the debate or the advocates saying we need a state military, a national military, rather than a party one. But we would see the backlash, which suggests to me there was some kind of debate percolating at that point that she very much wants to squash. So he wants them to be read. I think that is paramount important to him. I think, but he hasn't gone light on the expertise necessarily, right? It's not like the guys that he's elevated to these positions, necessarily lack the competence or the wherewithal to have some of the positions they hold, even if they've gotten helicopter promotions. I think one of the things that's very much on Xi's mind is the fact that the PLA hasn't been to war since its war with Vietnam in the late 70s, and then maybe, some skirmishes throughout the 80s. And it hasn't seen blood. It hasn't been shot at in anger. And so given how small the pool is of people with that experience, there are people in the high command, and I think that she's put a premium on who are involved in that fighting.
Right? Yeah, isn't there one guy? Aren't there two guys who were like majors in 1979 or something who stuck around past 67?
Yeah, I think that's right. So he likes that. He wants somebody who's around, who's been shot at in anger, who has seen blood in the field. And now that I think about it, it kind of comports with again with Joseph Torigian's biography of Xi's father and what it means for Xi's own mindset, right? She likes people who've suffered a little bit, who've been hardened, who've been tempered, right? He doesn't want somebody that's only known, kind of ease and glory and prosperity.
Talk about the idea of like a political versus apolitical military.
Right. So there is, I think there is a real difference, and it can feel a little abstract sometimes, but in our own system, for instance, right, we have a long tradition of having an apolitical military, right? One that doesn't insert itself into politics. And in addition to that culture that's long-standing, right, you also have various layers of mechanisms to ensure civilian control of the military, right? You have people like who populate, civilians who are in the office of the Secretary of Defense, right, who have to sign off on it. We obviously have a civilian Secretary of Defense. China has none of that, right? And I think that's a really stark difference, right? So they don't have the same kind of checks and acculturation for to ensure political neutrality and to ensure that the party doesn't get involved in politics. But it's also, it's not part of their self-conception. I think part of the PLA's conception in its own mind is that they are the ones that conquered China for the Chinese Communist Party, right? And especially for the ground forces, like that is their history and that is their legacy. Maybe one pithier way to bring this home for listeners, to imagine this, it would almost be like if there were an armed wing of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, right? And they come to power, and that's who becomes the armed forces, right? Yeah. They are loyal to them, and their job is to keep them in position and to keep them into power. That is kind of the PLA's original raison d'etre, right? And that is an important facet of it that is core to its being.
Yeah, I think that the argument you're making, which was interesting, is that in the early years, when Xi showed up to Beijing, he didn't necessarily see that sort of like red energy, but more saw an organization which, was entirely this self-contained institution. Yep. But also didn't necessarily, was kind of like professionalizing. I mean, it's more like, 1870s Germany than, this like bleeding red mechanism.
I think that's right. They were more preoccupied with, operational proficiency, with, building out their navy, maybe even, acquiring overseas military access, that sort of thing, right? Like the big flashy stuff, rather than with long sessions of indoctrination in Marxist ideological tenets, right? And I think it's important to keep in mind too. I mean, I think in any system, even in a highly professional one, by design, the military is a relatively insular institution. I mean, there's a reason people in Washington call the Pentagon the puzzle palace, right? It's very technologically advanced. It's got its own culture. It's got its own intricate layers of bureaucracy and personal networks. And that's true of any military. But if you're talking about the PLA, and you have to think about it this way too, like the only real meaningful bridge from the civilian side of the party to the military is Xi Jinping himself. And you might have some contact or exposure as a provincial official, right? Maybe there's mobilization exercises and you might have some contact, but really that nexus with the PLA, because it's so politically salient, is so closely guarded. That's why there's no other civilians on the Central Military Commission. Even when Xi is hanging out with the Central Military Commission of the PLA, he's in a uniform. He's not in civilian garb, right?
I do love this line where you say that she hauled the entire high command to historic revolutionary sites where Mao institutionalized the party's control of the military. We're having fun little. You wrote this before our sort of Quantico shenanigans over the past few weeks, but anyways, we'll see where this all takes us.
I think I originally said schlep, but the editors took it out and made me say hauled.
Rude. This is why you don't write for Foreign Affairs, and you write for China Talk instead. Let's talk Taiwan. So you make this argument that, she's had, I think it's fair to say, a lot of success in power consolidation, corruption fighting, PLA modernization. The economy, I don't know, TBD, but also does he really care all that much? It seems like a, second, third priority for him. But Taiwan, which is clearly something he cares about deeply, has not seen a lot of momentum towards a solution that he would be proud to have written in the history books next to his time as party chairman. Let's reflect on the past decade plus of Xi Taiwan policy and how it could potentially evolve into a fourth term in a post-2028 election.
Yeah, it's a great point. And in my mind, what really stands out is if you rewind to a decade ago, Xi's Taiwan policy, picking up on the Hu Jintao administration's policy, was actually really bearing some fruit. And I feel like the big culminating event would have been 10 years ago when Xi Jinping shook hands with then Taiwan President Ma Ying-jeou in Singapore, right? And that would have been the first time you had a meeting like that, right, between the head of the CCP and, the head of the ROC since the Marshall Mission in 1946 when Mao met with Chiang Kai-shek. And I think for Xi, he loves that kind of historical precedent, right? But it was also ended up being a high watermark for his Taiwan policy. And of course he had to deal with Tsai Ing-wen and the DPP ever since then, pretty much. But I think what was really interesting going into the last election on Taiwan in early 2021, what was on my mind was that I was worried that Xi and those around him were going to realize, frankly, kind of the intellectual bankruptcy that's been at the core of their Taiwan policy, right? Because I think what you've had over a longer trajectory is initially going back to Hu Jintao, kind of a softer approach, a very Marxian approach, right? I think the line of thinking was that if we change the economic structure, the political superstructure will change, right? So as China's economic clout goes and economic ties with Taiwan become closer, Taiwan's just eventually going to come into China's orbit. It's going to fall like an apple off a tree into their growing gravity, right? But after the election of Tsai, you see a clear pivot from Xi towards a more coercive approach, but that hasn't really been working. And what they've done in Hong Kong, of course, as everyone knows, has only further alienated Taiwan. So it seems like politically, the island has actually only gotten further away, if not geographically, because it can't, from the mainland, right? And so where does that leave Xi, and where does that leave his strategy? I think part of what happened in the election in 2021, I think there was probably a real alignment between China's outside voice and their inside voice about this, in the sense that I think they were relieved that the KMT won in the LY. So they were saying publicly afterwards, well, the fact that the KMT has won in the LY election shows that most people don't support the DPP and its pro-independence policies, yada, yada. But I think that's also how they self-soothe themselves that night too, saying it's okay. Our policy is still viable. We don't need to do a fundamental rethink yet at this point. And so it keeps hope alive. And I think, frankly, now that the DPP's recall campaign failed this summer, that probably gives Beijing a little bit more consolement, right? That maybe they don't have to really think about this. But what I worried about is that if it was a crunch, right, if the DPP did have a full seat in 2021, where does that leave Xi, right? Does he start to get antsy? And that's part of what I worry about. And I argue this in the China Leadership Monitor piece is what happens when Xi gets to his fourth term, right? And he's staring down the barrel of 80. It's possible they might not be, but if the DPP is still in power, does he have to have a deeper rethink? And I think he's shown a proclivity throughout his career when he does get frustrated, he does something to try to shake up the dynamic. He's not just content to let things stay on cruise control if he doesn't think it's going in the right direction, as we saw in Hong Kong, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think that necessarily means he's going to all of a sudden have an appetite for the Million Man Swim after 2028, but you could see some of those more coercive options that people talk about in Washington. I think you could see him really giving those a long and hard look.
Yeah, I think this, like the idea of him like all of a sudden overnight turning into Putin seems a little far-fetched with the track record that we have of over a decade of him not like just straight up invading countries. But I mean, yeah, Jon.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think in some ways, Putin is obviously an important partner for him, but it's also kind of a useful foil for him, right? He has a much greater appetite for risk than others in the Chinese system, right? Like a Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin. But that's, in the big scheme of things, that's a low bar to clear, right? And he doesn't have that same kind of penchant for just outright violence and risk taking that Putin has, right? He's much cageier and he's much more methodical, I think, in how he goes about taking risks. It's not that he doesn't take them, but they're much more calculated risks than kind of gambling on the roulette table.
So, Jon, often in conversations I have, people don't start with domestic Taiwanese politics or sort of like Xi end of life thinking, but they start with this idea of the Silicon Shield. We're, on the hierarchy of like things that factor into Xi's decision making when it comes to escalating around Taiwan. Like, where do you put the availability of access to Taiwanese chips or the kind of like broader economic fallout that an escalation could impose in the calculus?
So I would, no pun intended, decouple the two, right? I think the chips and TSMC, I think actually ranks very low on Xi's priorities when it comes to this, even though he's got this techno-industrial fetish. I think he has enough confidence that China will figure it out over time. And I think if he did make the decision to go for Taiwan, he'd scuttle it, right? That he would do what he needed to take the island, and I don't think it would factor very high in his considerations. I think that's separate from the broader economic fallout. I think the kind of cataclysm that could produce, I think is very much on his mind, right? And really gives him real pause. I mean, the way I think about it is that if he were to go for some kind of full scale invasion, he's basically gambling not just with his legacy, but with everything that the party has achieved since the death of Mao. All the progress it's made, all that it's built up, and it could really damage or undo the party's legitimacy. So I think he feels like if he's going to go in, he wants that level of surety because it's really kind of putting all the chips on the table. And it's a big gamble. And I think he'd rather not do that. And I think what he'd rather do, my thought is what his approach is in the meantime, it's coercive and it's just kind of to demoralize Taiwan over time, right? And just kind of keep up the drumbeat of pressure and hope that starts to cause the foundations of Taiwan's polity to crumble over time. He doesn't necessarily want to go for the blunt force trauma first, right? That's kind of the optional last resort given the costs.
Yeah, I mean the sort of like irony of all of this is that, if China evolves in a different direction, this all of a sudden becomes a lot more appetizing. Like the carrots that have been placed in front of Taiwan over the past, I mean, since the death of Mao have just like not really been all that compelling. But yeah. I mean, I like the sort of the early 80s, right? Like that was the height of this discussion when we had the most liberal version of domestic China. Yeah. And so for like it to ever really happen in a happy way, like that's really what's going to have to like that's really the development we're going to have to take. But the sort of like coercion into this just like does not seem like a viable strategy.
No, and it's interesting because you make that point about, in the early 80s when this was really a real possibility, right? Again, Joseph's biography has been on my mind all of this year after reading it this summer because it's so good. But who would have been the person in the central leadership in the
Yeah.
Secretariat with
Yeah.
the most experience dealing with Taiwan and dealing with the KMT and doing United Front work? It was Xi's old man, Xi Zhongxun. And I think it gets to another important facet of this. If you poke around in the open source material, it's not clear who has Xi Jinping's ear on Taiwan policy, right? There's not somebody like even a Liu He, right? Somebody that you can point to and say, this is the guy who's very influential with him. And I think a lot of that is because, again, I think this is part of his legacy as a princeling and as Xi Zhongxun's son in particular, right? I think that he thinks that he's got his own best handle on this issue because he understands this idea almost genealogically, and who knows how much they ended up discussing it. But I think if you pair that with his own career trajectory as well,
Yeah. And Xiamen, right? I mean, he dealt with this stuff.
yeah, he dealt with this stuff in Xiamen, in Fujian, in Zhejiang, right? I think he would have been vice governor during the Taiwan crisis in the 90s, right? So he would have had a front row seat to this whole dynamic for the previous 30 years. So my suspicion about this is that, rightly or wrongly, I think he has a lot of self-assurance on this particular set of issues, and that's why we haven't seen somebody as kind of his obvious consigliere on the set of issues in particular.
Yeah. So let's talk cognitive decline. Look, the actuarial tables give us it's like a 3% chance a year of like a stroke or him dying. And that steadily creeps up to like 3.2, 3.5 or whatever.
Yeah.
But there's also this like the guy gets old thing, where even if he is still kind of around and can be on for a few for 5-6 hours a day. I mean, we're already seeing him kind of dialing it back with this Li Chang dynamic where he's doing fewer, less international travel, meeting with less of the, prime minister of Swaziland when they show up or whatever. Setting aside a stroke or some like very dramatic thing where he's out of commission, what are the different pathways to think of Chinese politics over the next 5 or 10 years if he's just sort of slowly losing his edge over time?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question, and I think there's the actuarial table, right? But like I noted in the China Leadership Monitor piece, there's also just common sense observation. This is a guy who's now in his 70s. I mean, he's obviously overweight, and he's got an
Smoker.
smoker, maybe former smoker, and he's been doing this impossible job of governing the world's largest country for the last dozen or so years, right? Like he's got to be tired, right? So you have to think like that just takes a toll on him, and he's living in this highly fractious political environment where he's doing things like purging people on a regular basis, right? Or he senses threats even when there might not be. So that is just emotionally exhausting too. If you've grown up in that environment your whole life, and then you're the king, and you've got to deal with this on a daily basis to make sure you're on your A game. That in and of itself.
Well, maybe it works the other way too. Is it just like if this is just what gets him out of bed every day? I mean, there was this like Mao kind of always wanted to be a poet, right?
Yeah.
At some level, right? And sort of like his repose as emperor starting in the 60s and 70s. That was sort of what he would like wanted to do at some part of him, right? But like she lives for the shit. Like this is what gets him out of bed every day, I'm sure.
I think you're probably right. I think that probably by definition has to be the case. So maybe I'm projecting a little bit, right? Like it's like a shark, like he's got to stay in motion, right? Without the game, he would kind of wither. I think that's probably a real possibility for a guy like him. So the point is very well taken. I think for him, and you're right about Mao too, right? Mao became a poet, but to everybody's detriment, right? Because now and we're left with this kind of this Delphic model of leadership, right? Where people go to him and they're like, okay, I talked to the boss, but what does he really want us to do?
Yeah.
And I think that becomes one of the dangers as she ages, right? I mean, people talk about the succession question, but this is going to be one of the real conundrums. Number one, does he name a successor? I don't think he will until he gets into his 4th term, right? Or some kind of heir apparent. But then the perennial challenge is always you gotta build your successor up enough that they can stand on their own 2 feet once you're gone, but not so much that you feel like they become a threat to you, right? And even if he does start that process of building up, does that mean he in some ways moves to the second line and you end up with this kind of more fractious political environment like we saw in the Mao era, where he's just kind of giving oblique or unclear guidance and then people are running with that until they run afoul of the line, right? That becomes a much more precarious political dynamic, right? And I think there's two elements to it. I think there's what does she think about it, right? But then what do people around him start to think, right? They can observe the boss even at a distance. They can do the math and realize that this guy is just getting older, and at some point he's going to have to deal with this question, especially since by the end of his fourth term in office he'd be 79, right? So he'd be pushing 80. So I think that will start to shape the political jockeying that happens around him as people try to ingratiate themselves, think, either I could be the heir apparent or maybe my protege could become the heir apparent and I could be some kind of party grande. I think that will be very much on everyone's mind. The way I think about it, kind of big picture, is that there's two ways for this movie to play out. It's either going to look like Death of Stalin, right, where the military is going to be involved. It could potentially be punctuated by violence or a nominal heir apparent being displaced, or it's going to be like the movie Conclave, right, where there is a lot of subterfuge and backstabbing, but it all happens quietly and much more subtly off stage, right? And all anybody sees at the end is the black smoke emanating from the chimney.
Yeah. The sort of she leaning into the late Deng model or the Mao model, unless health really makes him and he's like really on his back foot. I mean, like being Deng and having to fire Zhao Ziyang and having to fire Hu Yaobang, like that's not something that must excite him. No. And like the fact that he has two sort of historical examples of this going really badly. Yeah. Plus the fact that, we have this whole cult of personality. He likes a lot of this job. He surely thinks he is like absolutely indispensable to the future of the party. I just think there's so much of him which is going to just try to push off dealing with this whole succession thing, that him moving to the second line strikes me as a very low probability event absent real health issues.
Yeah, I think that's probably a very fair point, right? I think he would be disinclined to do that, right, unless he really feels himself slowing down. I mean, your point too about both Deng and Mao and their succession processes, right? They both had to run through three successors, right, before they ultimately landed on somebody who kind of stuck, but not really, even in the case of Hua Guofeng, right? And you have to think again. I think about Xi as a princeling. He's got to be cognizant of that at some level, right? Like he undid the old model that Deng had put in place, where China had figured out some way to have, even if it was rocky or imperfect, some kind of peaceful way to transfer power. He's blown up that old system, but he's got to figure this out at some point, right? Yeah. I mean, he's kind of, like I say in the paper, he's kind of created a Henry VIII problem for himself, whereas Henry VIII spent his whole life obsessed with who is going to succeed him. She has done the opposite. He's tried to procrastinate as much as possible about this question and kind of destroy the old way for doing that.
Yeah. And as you point out, like the potential successors who don't have real PLA connections, like Hua and Zhao and Hu, they don't stick around because there is going to be some party person who is going to have that connection. And the fact that he is just not letting that develop at all is going to make it really hard for whoever else shows up to stick.
Yeah, I think that is exactly right. And she had a leg up, even though he had relatively thin military credentials, right? What did he have? He had 3 years as a Mishu to Geng Biao, right, in the late 70s, early 80s. He had Peng Liyuan, his wife, right, and maybe some peripheral exposure during his time in the provinces, but and his whatever princeling connections he had, but in the kind of post-Deng leadership, that put him head and shoulders above Li Keqiang or anybody else from his generation, right? It's kind of like the old line, like, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is all powerful. That's kind of Xi Jinping, right? He may not have been Deng when he started, but his colleagues were in Chen Yun and Yang Shengkun and other guys who were powerful in their own right. I think it captures, if I may, one other aspect of this too that's really interesting in terms of how the succession plays out. I think there's a big difference between if Xi gets one or maybe two chances to try to orchestrate his own succession, right, and dub his own heir, versus if he, kind of just drops dead tomorrow, right? I think you have a much different political dynamic in each instance, right? I think they're both going to be fraught and pretty rocky, but I think in terms of who gets top billing, how this all plays out, I think that will be very consequential in terms of how this plays out going forward.
Please elaborate.
Okay, so let's go with he drops dead tomorrow playbook, right? What happens then? I mean, it's unclear, right? And I think some people don't appreciate the fact that there is no line of succession in Chinese politics like we have in the United States. It's not like you go from the president to the vice president, right, to the Speaker of the House. There's nothing like that that's codified. In fact, for most of Xi's tenure, the vice president is a sinecure for an otherwise retired official. They're not even on the Politburo Standing Committee, right? So it kind of really throws open the door then to who gets the ring. I mean, if I had just had to take a guess, the person who would seem potentially most well positioned to do that would be Chi, right? Because he holds so many of the key portfolios in the party, right? He's running the general office from the Politburo Standing Committee, which, by the way, is the job that Stalin had under Lenin, right? And then that's what became the general secretary position for him eventually, right? The other aspect of it that I think really gives Tsai a leg up too, that we were just talking about, is that exposure to the PLA. Because he's also on the National Security Commission, that would, unlike other members of the Politburo Standing Committee, give him an excuse to engage with those other power ministries, right? With the security services and with the PLA in a way that his other colleagues on the Politburo Standing Committee or even on the broader Politburo would not necessarily have those opportunities. So again, it may not be much, but it would give him, I think it could potentially give him a leg up. I think the downside for a guy like Tsai Chi, if I think about this, is that could also make him the guy who has a target on his back right away.
Yep.
Because if I can deduce this all the way from Washington, surely his colleagues in Zhongnanhai can figure this out too, right? So again, I think of the death of Stalin scenario. Does he become kind of like Beria, the guy that everybody else decides to gang up on? He obviously doesn't have the same kind of stigma that Beria had, but does everybody else?
He hasn't killed everyone's aunts and uncles.
Yeah, exactly.
As far as we know.
Yeah. He doesn't have that kind of hideous reputation, and he's not the source of resentment in the same way. But it is possible everybody else gangs up on him, and then they decide among themselves who should get the ring, right? And my suspicion is that they will probably be able to figure out, though. I think this has been kind of a limiting factor, even in a crisis like Tiananmen, right? And as fraught as that was for the leadership, they still have a sense that this needs to be bound, because if this gets out of control and kind of leaves the corridors of power, and you have people doing what Zhao Ziyang did and reaching out to constituencies and the public, then things could really unravel, right? Yeah. And I think especially for these guys that are kind of like what Jiang Zemin was in 1989, where they don't have a power base of their own necessarily, I think they are mindful of that as well, right? That they need to preserve the system and kind of figure this out. So there'll be conflict, but it'll probably be bounded in some ways. This would be my guess, right?
Yeah, like the hang together versus hang separately.
Yeah, exactly. But it's totally different if he has an opportunity to kind of start to groom somebody, right?
Yeah, let's tease out that scenario.
So if he has the chance to groom somebody, maybe that person sticks, but it's just, then the main question is going to be a function of time, right? And
let's stay on this for a second.
Sure.
Like, where is he even getting data points about like 50 somethings? I mean, is he like having dinner with these people? Like he's getting reports on their mayoral performance. I mean, it's a hard information problem because he doesn't have these personal relationships with the people who are in his age cohort.
Yeah, bingo. That's right. And this is kind of the downside of Xi having populated the whole Politburo Standing Committees with his whole old buddies, right? Like I've jokingly called this Xi's frat house, right? Right. It's very different. He walks into a Politburo Standing Committee and all of these guys. Can you imagine walking into a meeting where you're the boss and you look around the table, and with the exception of Huang Kuning, you've known all these guys for 30, 40 years, right?
It's weird.
Yeah.
It's weird.
Yeah. I mean, that's got to be very comfortable for him.
Yeah.
Right. But
it's interesting because usually like presidents, they have like one of those guys or like two of those guys. Yeah. But then everyone else is kind of like from the professional. Okay, like, all right, we're going to have Bobby Kennedy, but then we're going to have like 10 other pros.
Right.
And the fact that that's not the case. Yeah.
So Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's right. So it's got to be very comfortable for him in some ways. And, you know, if he does abide by the informal term limits, right, the 7 up, 8 down rule, which he actually has for the most part. He's made some exceptions like with John Gyoshi and others, and he could make more exceptions, but I think kind of in onesies and twosies. That means that a lot of those guys on the Politburo Standing Committee who he has those deep relationships with are going to have to go at the next party Congress. And then what is he going to have to rely on? It's going to be his proteges, or like what I like to call, like, they're going to be his bridge friends, like his friends, right? And not necessarily the people who are truly in his own inner circle. So it's a great question. Like, how does he get information about them? And I think what it's going to feed, and I spell this out again in that China Leadership Monitor piece, the people who are in Xi's orbit, even the ones who are inside the asteroid belt, my suspicion is that they don't all necessarily like each other, right? Because if you look at their backgrounds and where Xi connected with them, he collected these guys at different points in his career, right?
Mhm.
And I don't think they all necessarily like each other, right? And so as you get into people start around, this is why it's so important that people around him will start thinking about the succession process, even if Xi doesn't. All those people who are in that inner circle, I presume, would start thinking about how to position their own proteges to ingratiate themselves with Xi, right? So that somebody from their network is the person who ultimately gets the nod rather than somebody else, right? And I think that creates a much more frothy and fraught political environment in Beijing, even more so than what we've seen already in this third term.
Yeah. I mean, you'd almost rather have like six people in their 50s show up as opposed to just one person in their 50s show up,
Yeah.
because then there's just this whole weird dynamic, succession drama. Like, okay, I got to purge this guy. But yeah, all right. If we're thinking on a 10-year horizon and we're going
Yeah.
to do this two more times,
Yeah.
then yeah, let's have these people hang around for a little while and we'll
Or
get a
if you're planning
sense
to
for
live to
that.
150 or you're squarely middle aged at 75.
Well, the thing is, like, does only he get to live to 150, or does like the frat house also get the, quantum livers and what have you?
It probably depends. It's probably going to be like if you stay in his good graces, you still get the magic serum, right? But that's the other interesting thing too. Like, so I mean, there's another conundrum too. Like, maybe he would want to pick somebody who's from that inner orbit to be his heir apparent, somebody that could trust, somebody that could carry on his legacy. But the problem is that,
You can't trust anyone.
well, you
You
can't trust
literally can't
anyone.
trust anyone.
Yeah, exactly. Trust falls are not part of the CCP indoctrination system, I don't think. Um, so you can't trust anyone. And also, to the extent that these are people you trust and would think about handing the mantle to, they're also old, right? So what's the benefit
Yeah.
of handing over the mantle to somebody who's just 5 years younger than you and could also have similar health problems, and people could also be eyeing him as well? You're going to want somebody, like you said, that's a lot younger. And for Xi, they're going to look like whippersnappers to him, right?
Yeah.
Whoever comes up next.
Yeah. And the sort of, for those people in their 50s, there's this very interesting dance, right? Where they have to like look like they're good, but not too good, because you can't overshadow the guy, or you can't have too many new ideas. I mean, just like the fact that we have such a sort of ideological, like Xi Jinping thought cage
Yeah.
around all these folks means that their ability both to kind of distinguish themselves as the most capable of their sort of age cohort is limited. But then, like, yeah, you got to make sure that this guy doesn't think you're too handsome and vigorous and
Exactly.
popular, right? Because
Exactly.
there's some golden mean there.
Yeah. And yeah, it's like the old line, the nail that sticks up ends up getting hammered down,
Yeah.
right? And that's kind of the name of the game for their system. And it's interesting too because that is exactly the needle that she threaded, right? And why I think he took so many people by
Totally.
surprise. I mean, I think people forget this because it feels almost like ancient history at this point, but she went into Shanghai as party secretary after becoming the heir apparent at a time where they had just gone through a major corruption scandal, right? Where under Hu Jintao, the then party secretary, Chen Liangyu had thumbed his nose at the leadership. And Hu Jintao, for the first time, or the only time I can think of in his tenure, mustered himself to go after this guy and topple him from the Politburo, right? And she, I think, he treaded very lightly in Shanghai. He did enough to show he was serious. but not, it was kind of like skill and Charybdis for him, right? He had to do enough to show that he was serious about anti-corruption, but not so much that he started to piss off the wrong people and jeopardize his own chances. I mean, it was kind of a hot potato to take that job. And he pulled that off. And I think it's such a striking contrast with what we were talking about earlier about once he came into power, right? And how hard he went after everyone once he had the ring. The other point I wanted to make too, Jordan, is that, there was this notion going back to the summer about the coup rumors with Xi Jinping. The tacit assumption of that is that it's going to be Xi Jinping versus some other kind of constituency in the party. And from my perspective, that moment passed a long time ago, right? If there was going to be a backlash against him, it would have had to materialize much earlier, like when he was going after the monkeys instead of the chickens, right? Like during that first term, and he was taking down a lot of these made men. Once he did that, it becomes much harder for other people in the system to conspire against him, right? And to marshal their forces, because it's almost like a bad game theory problem, right? Like, if I, reach out to you to depose the boss, you have every incentive to sell me out to the boss and ingratiate yourself and further climb up. Now, I think this is part of what I'm trying to argue in the piece, is that now the real dynamic, it's not about Xi versus some other constituency. And I hesitate to reach for the Mauer analogy. It's almost like the Mauer in the sense that they're all Xi Jinping acolytes, but the fractiousness is going to be among each other, right? As they try to muscle out their own rival, to muscle out their rivals for positions and promotions and for the sake of their own network, right? That is going to be the really crucial dynamic, I think, in the next 5-7 years, not Xi versus some antipode in the system, because he's eviscerated all those possibilities. It's going to be among his own people.
So I'm proud of us for doing like an actual quote unquote traditional China talk episode. We haven't really mentioned America in our first whole hour, but I do want to talk about like what agency, if at all, what, if any, agency America, West, allies like have on these sort of internal succession dynamics.
I think for the most part, very, very little. I mean, never mind, having an impact on them. I think it's very hard for a lot of people even to see into them, right? And to try to get a sense of what's going on inside the system. So I don't think that we are necessarily a big factor. To the extent that we are a factor, I think it's more, not necessarily in the background, but we're kind of seen, I think, almost in these very Leninist terms as a structural force of history, right? As kind of the avatar of late finance capitalism, right? That we're declining and we're dangerous and we're very powerful, and that you're going to need a leader who's got the stomach and the wherewithal to deal effectively with the United States, right? And that is strong enough to see shepherd China for the next phase of what she likes to call the new era, right? I think outside of that, kind of on a more tactical basis, day to day, I don't think for these internecine politics, it necessarily plays a large role. The one exception to that is that, I think there's been this notion in the past, right, that you want to try to cultivate some kind of relationship with key people inside the political system as an American policymaker. But I think what's counterintuitive and what happens in their system is that having that nexus is, makes it actually much harder for that person to ascend the ranks, right?
Yeah.
Because it's baggage, right? That makes them vulnerable to criticism that they're too sympathetic to the United States or too cozy with the United States, right? And you have
you only got promoted because of your CIA bribe. I mean, we can move on, John. But yeah, no, there's like a kiss of it's like the reverse of like America funding the NGOs in Russia or whatever.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. It's like, you were really smiling in that photo op in the Great Hall of People. Like, I think that was like 2 degrees too much smiling.
So talking about standing up to American imperialism, the sort of Liberation Day followed by retaliatory tariffs and a rare earths ban, I think you can argue is the most dramatic Chinese coercive move against the U.S. that you've seen since really like support for Ho Chi Minh, potentially, right? I think this is a very dramatic disjuncture from what you saw in Trump 1 or in Biden, where, Trump run trade war, it was like, all right, we're just going to keep this with the trade war things, and some stuff will get more expensive, whatever. But the sort of impact that the rare earths controls had on getting the Trump administration, it seems, to like really rethink their Chinese economic and broader policy, like that seems to be very, I don't know. That seems like a lesson that if I was Xi, I would really be taking to heart. What's your read on them deciding to push back at the beginning of Trump 2?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I think the way you contextualize it is right. I think in the first Trump administration during the first trade war, it was almost palpable that Xi and his lieutenants were kind of groping around for some kind of adequate countermeasure to the initial tranche of tariffs during the first Trump administration, right? And like my operating model for how they were behaving at the time was they wanted countermeasures, and the paradigm was no escalation, no concessions, right? They wanted to do enough to show that they were pushing back, but and at the same time, try to make as few meaningful concessions as possible. I would say too, especially my view from the inside during the Biden administration, I was really struck as I reflected on my time there, how little pushback we got for a
Yeah.
lot of our competitive actions, right? Like, I was involved in planning for President Biden's first in-person meeting with Xi Jinping in November of 2022. And just a month before that was when we dropped the first big export controls, right? It was in October of 2022. And the reaction was very muted. Like, yeah, they fetched, but not that much, right? And they didn't really do anything for a long time. And even with the subsequent efforts to kind of tighten those export controls and plug some of the gaps, you didn't really see much movement from the Chinese side, right? Or not much in the way of a response, which I think was really striking. Maybe not until summer of 2023, right? But even then, they were relatively restrained. I think what's interesting is when did you
Well,
see
let's
them? Yeah, please.
let's stay on that diagnosis here. Do you think they were surprised? They didn't listen to China talk, didn't realize how big a deal it was? Did they just think they could build the chips on their own? Whatever, screw these guys. What's your analysis of what the Biden administration did right in boiling the frog?
It was clearly the lack of access to China talk first and foremost. But I think the other factors, I think it's a couple of things, right? I think one is that we were very focused on our competitive actions, but we did have this parallel track of diplomacy, right? And we were managing the competition, to use the phrase that was getting thrown around at the time, right? So there was, I think that those diplomatic engagements, they help offset the pressure that would accrue from pursuing these competitive actions against China, right? I do think they were also surprised, especially with the initial tranche, right? That came out, and I think it took them a while to figure out how exactly they wanted to respond. But I do think having that regular cadence of high-level diplomatic engagements, it makes it hard for them to say, well, now is the time for us to retaliate, right? It does constrain them in some ways, just because, when you have those meetings, they're by definition positive meetings, right? And so they kind of backstop whatever it is that you're pursuing, or kind of put a limit on how harsh the response might be. So I think that is very much part of that. And when you got to Trade War 2.0 and Liberation Day, we didn't have that, right? We didn't have that diplomacy to backstop it, right? There were the
Right.
engagement was
Sorry, let's come. We'll come back to the rare earth stuff, but
Yeah.
I want to stay on 2022
Yeah.
for a second. What was your Pelosi visit, Taiwan missile, like how was that experience for you, John? Everything you wanted and more about from government service?
Yeah, I got like 3 years of government service in a single year. I mean, that was a remarkable year in so many ways, right? Because if you rewind, right, you go back to February 2022, Russia invades Ukraine, right? And then we had shortly thereafter the engagement between National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Yang Jiechi in Rome shortly thereafter, right? And that was a very intense period. And for me personally, I went back to work in the new year, and then I basically disappeared. And when I came out on the other side of that, after Jake had met with Yang Jiechi and President Biden did his phone call at the end of that week with Xi Jinping, it was springtime and flowers were blooming in my backyard, and I hadn't seen any of that happening in the preceding several months. So I mean, that was a very intense period and kind of a giant vortex that I disappeared into for a period of time. I mean, the other moment that year that was really crucial, that was really punctuated by a high point in tensions of choice, was the Pelosi visit to Taiwan, right? And that was incredible. Yeah, I mean, that was incredibly intense. I mean, I think, I basically disappeared that summer and did not see my family, like sent them on vacation on their own, and just, kind of, as you kind of do with those jobs already, you just kind of move into the office, right?
And so what were the, like, how worried were you guys? I mean, what were the dynamics that summer in particular that you were trying to manage?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely an anxious period. I think the key thing was how do you bound this, right? How do you bound this problem set and keep things from getting out of control, right? Especially given the way that Beijing responded. And from my perspective, in all honesty, this was kind of a manufactured crisis on Beijing's part, right? I mean, they reacted this way, but they also chose to react this way. Like the Trump administration had sent the HHS secretary, but chosen not to lob missiles over Taiwan. Of course, like we cited the precedent at the time that Newt Gingrich had gone to Taiwan back in the 1990s. So there was precedent for this. It was a separate branch of government, right? Pelosi was going to go.
But she's part of the Democratic Party, Jon. Of course you have agency.
Right.
Be able to tell her what to do and not.
Yes. And of course, both of our political parties have central discipline inspection commissions that enforce, the part and the party's code. No, I think that's the big difference. And that's what you wonder about. Where is the breakdown in their system? Because you do have people in the system, like the embassy, of course, but even like people like Yang Jiechi, who had been an interpreter on the Chinese side and who was the top foreign policy official during that time. I mean, there are pictures of him interpreting for Deng in his meetings with Reagan going back to the 80s. Like, he clearly has a very finely grained sense of our system and how it operates. But I don't know if that expertise necessarily percolates all the way up in the system. Like, it seems like at some point, I don't know if it was an actual breakdown where people were just not getting it and just mirror imaging and saying, yeah, but they're part of the same party, and therefore there's command and control there, and this is intentional, or if it was convenient, right? This is a way to put pressure on the U.S., right, and hold them accountable for the choices of Congress, right? So that was, I think that was a key facet of all of this, right? And then how do you signal that this is not okay, that that what our objective is to preserve peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait and demonstrate that seriously, and deter additional Chinese countermeasures, right, that could be even more escalatory. I mean, one of the things that's really striking to me and how they responded to that too. Number one, it was a choice on their part. I do think that. But what's amazing to me too is if you look at this at a larger historical arc, after all of the military modernization, as dramatic as it's been, the response, you could argue, in some ways was qualitatively similar to what happened in the 1990s, where they got angry and they lobbed missiles over Taiwan, right? And I think there were things that they did differently in this go around. And there was obviously they had the capacity to operate on the eastern side of Taiwan, right, and kind of have more of a chokehold than they did in that previous crisis. But in some kind of gross way, it was kind of a similar response, even after all is said and done. And again, it's not clear to me from their perspective, what did they necessarily accomplish with doing that? I mean, I suppose you could argue that it did help them kind of create a new normal in the Taiwan Strait, right? And that we've seen an uptick that's been sustained in the Strait in the years since then.
Yeah, but do you trade that for convincing Biden to put export controls on chips? I mean, I don't know. It's a tricky calculus.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think I think it was clear that the technology piece was going to be part of the administration's policy, right, throughout, right? I think the big question was, when, how big, the scope of it, right? But I think even the fact that you had you had created a separate directorate on the National Security Council for technology and national security policy was in and of itself a signal that this was going to be important, right?
Yeah. So let's pick up on the other piece of this,
Yeah.
like American officials over and over telling China not to give Russia weapons, where we've had, I think by the end of the Biden administration, Blinken was like, you guys are fucking doing this. Like, we see you. And then over the past few months, you've had more and more explicit reporting. I think it was Wang Yi who went to Europe a month or two ago and basically said, look, without us, they'd have lost this war already. Reflections on American agency over that dynamic over the past 5 years.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And I think what Wang Yi has said, and you've seen this talking point from a couple of other Chinese diplomats as well. It's like, no, we're not supporting Russia, because if we were, they'd be winning this war, right? Which is a great way.
Yeah, he said it both ways.
Yep.
He said, like, they would have lost already and they would have won already. So,
Right.
like, look, guys, like,
well, it's another great
a
instance,
break.
too, of saying the quiet part out loud. And it was kind of especially surprising coming from Wang Yi, who's usually otherwise very deft in these kind of engagements, right? Saying, yeah, they have to win, because if the U.S. is no longer focused on this, then they're just going to turn towards us, toward China, right? So truly saying the quiet part out loud. But I would say this. I mean, I think we are an important factor in this entente between Russia and China. But I think what people don't appreciate is how important this was to Xi, even going back to the start of his tenure, right? Like, the data point I always point to is that Xi's first state visit after becoming general secretary and president was to Moscow and to meet with Putin, right? And so I think that was a very clear signal early on that he wanted to put a premium on this relationship, right? And of course, there's the stat that in the years since then, they've met like 40 plus something times. They've called each other best friends. There's a little bit of a bromance there that, may not be real, but that's certainly the image that they want to project, right? And I think what happened is that what the war in Ukraine really did was, I think, it intensified that dynamic that was already underway, right? There was already an entente between the two sides. So I think it brought it to light for a lot of people, or really brought it home for a lot of people. And I think it also accelerated and intensified that dynamic. I think they have gone further and have deepened that relationship. And I think the U.S. is a factor in this. I think they very much see things through that kind of Kissingerian triangular dynamic, and they want to hug each other close, right? Because they see themselves in this kind of longer, tougher competition with the United States. So I think that's an important factor. I think the things that we do tactically, maybe to entice one side away from the other, I don't think that really matters that much in some ways, because I think it's so baked in to their worldview. The strategic choice has been made. And I actually think at this point in the war, I think from Xi's perspective, even if there's kind of grumbling among experts or people in the system about it, I think he feels like he made the right bet, right?
Yeah.
That this was a smart play, back the Russians and keep them in the game and keep them involved in this fight, and make sure that Putin doesn't lose this war, So I think the key challenge then is I don't think it's really possible to drive a wedge between the two of them, just given how they see a deep alignment of their strategic interests. I think the best you can kind of do is limit it to the extent possible, and even that I think is very challenging and quite difficult, because you are dealing with two very formidable powers in their own right.
Yeah. So do you think there was, all right, so just so we, for the record, this was like July of 2025, the reporting said that Wang Yi told European Union's top diplomat that Beijing didn't want to see a Russian loss because it feared the U.S. would shift its whole focus to Beijing.
Yep.
And then he said the negative version. So he said Wang rejected the accusation that China was supporting Russia's war effort, insisting that if it was doing so, the conflict would have ended long ago. I don't know if he's right about that. I mean, it's like it's not necessarily just a materiel thing. And I think there's also some like stochastic, okay, like if Russia's doing better, then the amount of aid that the West would have given Ukraine would have increased. And, there's arrogant here. It's like we've seen surges and surges of like new Western wonder weapons like not do their thing. It also doesn't seem to be like Russia's problem that like they have enough materiel to do their stuff. Like that's not really the limiting factor here. So what's your take on that as like a analytical assertion?
I mean, it's wonderful because it's so impolitic because it puts down the Russians at the same time that it allows them to deny that they're playing a role, right? I mean, look, I think their support has been consequential, right? And there's been other U.S. officials who have said this on the record, right? So I think it's real, and I don't think it's trivial. But if you're playing with the counterfactual, okay, if China supported Russia, but what kind of support would that be, right? And I think people forget about this too, is that because we've become accustomed to thinking about China as a global power. I think yes, China cares about its entente with Russia. Does China care what happens in Ukraine? Not especially, which is also in and of itself a limiting factor, right? They don't want to see Putin lose. They kind of have some negative end states they want to avoid. They want to maintain Russia as a strategic partner. But what actually happens in terms of the specifics on the ground, I think there's a certain, there's a certain parochialism to how they conduct their foreign policy. It's like, how is this going to affect me? Is this going to affect me? Then you guys figure it out, and we will posture as the proponents of peace in the meantime.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of like Eldridge Colby, Xi Jinping. I mean, there's some like nice little lines to draw there, but no, it's an interesting counterfactual. Like, are they going to do the North Korean thing of literally sending troops? In no universe would that happen. And then so we get to like the stocks of old stuff. Like, would you send like old artillery shells? Maybe. Is that going to win the war for the Russians? I don't think so. So then you have the more exquisite stuff, and it's like, all right, like China has sort of limited capacity of all their fancy missiles, just like the West does. How much, even if they really wanted to lean in, were they really going to hand over all of their long range strike capabilities? Are we going to give fighter jets? No. Like, so it's and like, are we going to put our economy on a war footing to like manufacture 10 or 100x more drones for the Russians to use? Like, also kind of no. So I think the sort of like the reasonable ceiling of, even if Xi or a different leader besides Xi wanted to lean in more, was probably just giving them old stuff, which I don't think would have been decisive over the past 3 years.
Yeah. Maybe. I mean, I think there's probably a few different ways it could play out, but I think this idea of like putting all the chips on the board, right, was probably not in the cards because it wouldn't necessarily serve their interest, right, to get so intimately and directly involved. And in fact, I had this really funny moment. I mean, one of the interesting things about leaving government and joining a think tank is now I participate in all these track 2 dialogues, right, with Chinese counterparts. But we were talking at one point about this very issue, and it was right after North Korea. It wasn't long after North Korea had sent in its own troops to support Russia's war, and I had a Chinese counterpart just lean in, who had towed the party line for hours on this issue. But all of a sudden, this person just leans into me and said, "It's so stupid. Why would they do that?" This is why you do these things, right? Because you sit there for hours listening to the stuff that you could use ChatGPT to generate, and then you get like that one little illuminating nugget, right? That's really telling about their strategic thinking on this issue.
And I think it's also like that is also illustrative to just how seriously we should take the Taiwan war invasion, because if you really wanted to do something, like, you would want to test your gear against what NATO is bringing to the table, and you would want to have your sort of like command and control ecosystem like actually do the thing.
I could see them making it, some constituency making a case for that in their system, but I mean, it's going to be a bigger.
It's a big step. It's a big step. Fair. All right. I see the different paths. We should get back to rare earths. I took us on like a 30-minute detour. All right.
That's fine. You can fix it in the editing and make it linear.
Absolutely not. So, okay. So we have China not physically punching back around Mariupol, but economically using rare earths to cause a substantial, just to reportedly surprise the Trump administration and then cause a substantial rethink in how they were going and how aggressively America was going to economically take on Beijing. What's your interpretation of all that?
So my interpretation is that I think a lot of this got lost, but what was striking to me was the not so subtle signals that China started sending after Election Day, after Trump won the election in 2024 and before Inauguration Day, right? Because at the end of the Biden administration, there were obviously all these export controls and competitive technology policies that were getting buttoned up during that period or pushed out during that period. And we saw China respond, unlike that 2022 period or in earlier periods, with great alacrity, right? They were responding, and they were responding, fairly forcefully and pretty quickly. And so, the take at that time, I think, especially like in some of the, like in the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, for instance, was, oh, this was sending a signal to the new administration. But I think also what they were doing was building up leverage in anticipation of Trade War 2.0, right? So they had very clearly spent the intervening years thinking about how they would respond to this and how they would retaliate. And I think that was the first wave of them test driving some of these new toys and tools that they had come up with in the intervening years, right? And I think part of what happened for the Trump administration, I think it was really twofold. I think there was a real misdiagnosis about how China was going to respond to this. I think number one, in fairness to the administration, I think a lot of people who would have served in Trump 1.0 would have said, look, we can push the Chinese and they're not going to do much in response, right? Like, look what happened in Trump 1. We hit them with these tariffs. The sky didn't fall. They wanted to negotiate with us. And so it will be okay, right? And again, in fairness to them, if they looked at what happened in the Biden administration, I would agree, right? There really wasn't much of a meaningful response to a lot of these measures. So you could see why they would feel, not if not complacent, pretty assured that China's response might be muted. I think the other thing that happened too is that, a year ago in 2024, all the discussion in Washington was about peak China because of their economic doldrums, right? And I haven't heard this firsthand, but my suspicion is that whoever briefed Trump on China's economy as they were gearing up for Liberation Day and Trade War 2.0, if they were smart, they would have led with the fact that China's real estate sector was a mess and was the locus of all their economic problems right now, right? Sure. Like that would just, one has to imagine that would just leap out at his imagination and make him think like, I've got a lot of leverage. If I hit these guys, they're not going to hit me back. And that's kind of the story of what happened in the first trade war, right? So I think there was kind of an exaggerated sense of the fragility of China's economy that fed into this, right? And I think they underappreciated the ways in which Xi and his team had been thinking about this methodically and preparing for it over the intervening 4 years, right? So when this happened, I mean, it was very clear, but just from the speed with which they responded, right? Like they weren't formulating new options. They clearly had, they were clearly locked and loaded for Trade War 2.0 when it happened, which is why it escalated so quickly, right? So I think they were ready for this, and it's kind of remarkable to me that they've gone just within the space of 6 months or so, right? It's been almost exactly 6 months since Liberation Day. They've gone from getting hammered by the Trump administration to now it seems like the administration is trying to mollify them in the run-up to a leader-level summit.
Yeah, I just read an article in Semaphore that said America doesn't have economic escalation dominance over China, which is wrong. But it's interesting that it seemed, and you saw Besant earlier this recently saying, oh, we could do stuff around engines, we could do stuff around, chemical inputs. I mean, there clearly is a menu of things that if Trump wanted to continue to raise the stakes, he could have. But the sort of psychological game that she was able to do, getting, the CEOs of Ford and GM to say, look, we're not going to be able to make cars anymore, right. Wormed into his head. I mean, say you're still sitting in the White House and the president asks you all right, what's my tat if they gave me the rare earths tit, aside from buying 10% of every minerals company in America, what coercive stuff would be on your menu?
That would so I think I think there are things we could do, but I think the bigger question is then to what end, right? Are you trying to escalate so you get them to back off eventually? Because I think it's not just a question of what tools do you have, but like what appetite do you have for pain, right? And I
Yeah.
think that's the really hard part is that I think Xi demonstrated during this. I think he's got more appetite for pain than we do. He's not going to have voters who are going to start complaining about an expensive Christmas, and he's not going to have to deal with that. I mean, we do have points of leverage. You know, there are select things we could do, right? Like the aviation sector is the obvious one that people like to point to. But again, to what end is that really going to accomplish what you're trying to do if your goal is to try to demonstrate that you have escalation dominance and get them to back off, right? I think one of the striking things to me, and you know, again, I'm not Gerard DePippo, I'm not an economist, but if you look at trade war 1.0 and 2.0, yeah, it had an effect on China. It hurt, but it had an effect on particular firms or particular sectors. It didn't necessarily have a big macroeconomic impact on China,
Yeah.
right?
And I think the sort of like one of the many initial theses around Liberation Day was like this is a way to force America and the world to decouple from
Yeah,
China. And it's kind of like the sort of we're recording this October 7th. We're sitting in the middle of a government shutdown. There's this like Republican line like we don't even care about the government being shut down because then we can fire all these people and this actually plays into our hands. And like the world where China concedes is the one where they really believe that Trump believes in that and doesn't kind of care about the pain. But I think what we've seen over the past 6 months is that he, in fact, does care about the pain. And the further this year develops and the closer we start getting to midterms, the more salient it is. So this sort of sequencing that some kind of Republican influencers talk about of like, all right, we're going to settle the Ukraine war and then turn our energy to China. It doesn't like the window is kind of closing for there to be sort of like any kind of domestic energy behind sort of eating the economic cost that would come from taking a more escalatory route from an economic perspective, I think.
I feel like I've heard this before. After we're done dealing with these global hotspots, we're going to pivot to Asia, right? It's really going to happen this time. Um, yeah, no, I mean, I think your point's well taken. But the other point about this that I think that's really salient is that time is actually on Beijing's side in this negotiation. I think it's one of the chief assets they have aside from these countermeasures. And I think the calculation from Beijing is if that is the view among people in the Republican Party or people in the Trump administration, this is actually going to play in Beijing's favor. I think from Beijing's perspective, because I think what they're banking on is as the administration gets closer to the midterm elections, they're going to want to have something to show for their efforts and for this prolonged negotiation with China, which I think the Chinese side thinks means Trump may start negotiating against himself or get antsy for a deal, right? And that's only going to augment Beijing's leverage in these discussions, right? And if you look back at Trade War 1.0, that's kind of what happened. That's how we ended up with phase one, was Trump got antsy for a deal. And he said, let's just do the deal and we'll call it phase one. And then, we can figure out the rest of it later. So I think from Beijing's perspective, that's what they're trying to do. And the fact that you now have the summit buys China runway through the end of the year. I think the fact that President Trump has gone out and said, we're going to do two more engagements only buys them more runway, right? Because now the President of the United States has publicly committed to additional meetings, even though China hasn't necessarily, right? So that gives them, if their goal is to run out the shot clock, they've just gotten themselves a lot of runway. So I actually, I hate to say it, but I give them credit for how well they have played this so far. And even if you rewind to earlier this year, when there was the initial meeting between Besant and Greer and He Feng, I mean, after that agreement, rather than having this kind of, grand coalition that was going to focus on China's unfair non-market practices, right, which, probably has some merit to it, instead, the only two countries at that point that the United States had some kind of side deal with for tariff relief was our closest ally, the United Kingdom, and our nominal chief rival, China.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, from Beijing's perspective, that's kind of an amazing feat of diplomacy. And what did they pay for this? Right? All they did was go back to status quo ante before Liberation Day. All they did was pull back the measures that they had imposed. So this is cheap, right? They're
Yeah.
getting all of this on the cheap.
Um, we still like, let's come back to cognitive decline, sort of both leaders trending in that direction over the next 3 years. I think there is just some variance that we haven't properly priced in, and sort of banking on 3 years of like everything being hunky-dory seems like a wrong bet. So it's hard to project out. Is it a balloon? Is it this? Is it Tibet border or something? But like I don't know. I don't think it's going to be this chill the whole time.
No, I think that's right. I think the name of the game for Beijing, even if there's something like that, like one of those exogenous shocks, like a balloon, or whatever the case may be, I think they have an incentive to try to manage that for the next year for the reasons I laid out. But you're right. This is very fraught, and even we see it right now, right in the run up to a summit where both sides, especially the U.S. side, is trying to to try to mollify Beijing. There are issues like the soybeans that are cropping up, right? There were additional entity listings just about a week ago that the Commerce Department imposed on a variety of Chinese subsidiaries, right? So it's fraught, right? So I think, what I worry about is that coming out of the summit, if there are good vibes coming out of it, right, and it doesn't go off the rails, that you're going to have a resuscitation of this discussion about détente with China, right? Or some kind of meaningful rapprochement. But I think actually what these first few months show is that you can give pretty remarkable concessions on two of the chief sources of friction in the relationship, on Taiwan and on technology competition, and still not really have any meaningful attenuation of the structural drivers of the competition, where it doesn't feel, like you said, like warm and fuzzy right now necessarily. It's more of a ceasefire than some kind of more meaningful or deeper détente.
Interesting. All right, Jon, let's stay on the cognitive decline stuff.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's going to be a thing, right? Because you're dealing with two leaders who are going to be who are in their 70s and who are aging in very stressful jobs. But to my mind, it's kind of like almost it's almost emblematic of the state of the competition between the two countries. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot, is that yes, U.S. and China are both superpowers, but they're both really dysfunctional in really profound ways, right? Like China obviously has its own deep pathologies with corruption, right? The real estate sector kind of encapsulates so many of those pathological dynamics where it's embedded with corruption and the failings of local government financing and how those are all intertwined, right? And I think just to, not as a partisan statement, but as kind of an objective observation, like our system is not functioning the way it should, right? Like we struggle to pay our bills on time and we don't make the repairs we need to our infrastructure. Like if we were in a homeowners association, we'd be on some kind of probationary status, right? So I think of this as kind of being emblematic of the competition, right? Sometimes it gets framed in terms of which side is more dynamic, but I think it's really about it's like two older people who have a lot of maladies, and the question is who can cope better with their maladies. This competition isn't about sprinting across the finish line. It's like the movie Grumpy Old Men. It's like Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon shaking their fists at each other as they approach the finish line on their walkers, right? It's kind of, not to be glib about it, it's kind of more my mental model for how this competition is going to play out in the next few years. It's going to be cranky and it's going to be ugly and it's going to be cantankerous.
That was dark, but probably the most accurate summation of the next 5 years of U.S.-China relations we've heard on this podcast. Jon, I want to sort of thinking about your like intellectual development, right? On the one hand, being in the agency the whole time, you get to read the secrets, but you don't really get to go to China. And I'm curious kind of like what, like, the strengths and weaknesses of developing as a China watcher when that is the sort of intellectual milieu that you grow up with over the decades.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. Unfortunately, like, I think this has become, especially after COVID and everything else, right? This is true for a lot of China watchers now, is that it's kind of hard to peer in. I would say a couple of things, right? I mean, your first resort, and I think this is true for a lot of China watchers, is you're kind of relegated to doing textual analysis, right? And I think that's just part of the price of doing business if you're doing this kind of work, right? Is going through the Party Congress work reports, right, and going through the press conference from the MPC, and not just reading those, but then doing side by side juxtaposed readings, right, to see what's changed over time, too. But I think what was really striking for me about doing this kind of work, and I think what's useful about it is that my job was not to opine about U.S. policy the way I was just now, right? My job, on a day-to-day basis was to think about how does this look from Xi Jinping's desk, right? And I think one of the striking things to me methodologically about this, especially as somebody who had studied political science and majored in it in college, was that this was not a social scientific enterprise, right? I wasn't thinking about this in terms of some kind of regression analysis or plotting points, to do this work, whether you're in government or out, it's much more humanistic in my mind. And it requires a lot more of moral imagination. It's almost more like being a historian where you're just going to read a lot of stuff. And then from reading a mountain of paper, try to make sense of it and try to tell a story that is coherent and faithful to the evidence that you do have. And it's really, I don't want to say it's like literary, but you are trying to think about if I'm in this guy and I put aside my priors as, a Western, small L liberal, how does this world look, right? And how do I try to navigate it? And how do I try to understand things in my own terms? So I think there's actually a lot of discipline that comes along with that, discipline in order to be able to do it well. But I think that is actually something that art of trying to see how it looks from Xi's desk, I think that's something that's harder to find on the outside. There are obviously people, like I keep talking about Joseph Torigian, who are able to do that, right? But I think that perspective of the conversation can get lost sometimes because it is such a big munchy dynamic. You can spend all day thinking about other aspects of the competition or thinking about what the U.S. should be doing to respond to what we're seeing from China, right? Yeah. So I think especially since I've left government, that's always my starting point, right? Like when I'm thinking through these problems, like the first thing I try to do is like think about, yes, looking at what the Chinese are saying, looking at what they're doing, because I think the context is so much more important than the text sometimes, right? And then thinking about how does this look from Xi's desk, just because that's the way I was trained to do that, right? And then working out from there.
On what dimensions do the secrets help you kind of build mental models and like develop your sense of the place, and on what dimensions is it irrelevant or beside the point? Can we answer that one?
It's challenging too. I mean, it's just, you just have other sources of information. But I think the real core part as an analyst, right, is building that mental model in the first place, right, and doing it in a rigorous way, right? Like the way I was trained, right, and the mental model that one wants to have, I think, is that you're not just chasing the latest reporting and then kind of retrofitting some kind of interpretation on what's going on in Chinese politics, right? You want to have some kind of a priori notion of what's going on, and then, to be intellectually honest, just do basic things like lay out signposts, like, okay, like if there is going to be a coup against Xi, or if Xi is losing power in the system, these are the things that I would expect to see, sure. And having that in place ahead of time so that you can start to sort the evidence as it comes in. Right, rather than saying like, I saw this wild video on YouTube from the Epoch Times and there's clearly going to be a coup, right?
Yeah.
I think that is a big part of the rigor of it. I think what's valuable about being at the agency to do that kind of work is that there's a focus on it in a way that you don't necessarily get in academia and on the outside, right? Like this is not something. It's hard to study from the outside, and it's not necessarily in vogue to focus on leadership politics in other countries if you're trying to get your PhD in political science, right? If you're a comparativist, you're trying to put things in comparative perspective, do a lot of math around it. So I think that's challenging. Whereas, I thought about this a lot. When you think about the CIA and what it was designed to do, it was designed to follow a country with a big, scary military and an opaque leadership, right? I mean, this is kind of the place's original raison d'etre, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I would say about, how this has all shaped my perspective on how I do this kind of work.
Yeah, it's interesting because like you have a cohort doing this, you do have this bright line of like, look, we're not analyzing American politics, which does not exist in think tanks. And it's so much easier and more natural to be like, to start with the end of the report instead of the beginning or middle of like, okay, what should America do about this? And then you kind of like back in your reading of the Chinese system or what have you. But because like that's what, that's how the funding works, and that's what the incentives are like having impact on policymakers. But like maybe like the thing you can do that is most useful is what you said, Jon, of just like building your mental model of who are these actors in the system and what are they working towards and how successful or unsuccessful are they being over time.
And it's funny you say that, because I think making that I think it's so natural to talk about what the U.S. should do for people in Washington outside of government. But this was always one of the funny things coming from the agency and having, grown up there professionally, especially when I started doing, when I worked in policy jobs, right? Because I would go from analyzing things, and then I would have my boss, like when I was at the Pentagon, say, okay, like, so what do we do about it, Jon? Right. And for me personally, like I'm a lifelong runner. It's kind of like if you're a runner and you think like, yeah, I can do a triathlon, and then you get on a bicycle and you're like, I'm feeling a lot of burn in places I didn't expect to. Right. I thought I was in good shape, but this is an adjacent muscle set. Right.
Sure.
And it's good to have both, but I obviously got a huge dose of that at the NSC. But leaving government too, it's really striking to me, right? Because that's what a lot of people like, when I engage from people in my current role in Brookings, I walk in the mindset, I'm like, okay, have I read like everything she has said in the last week? Like, do I have my ducks in a row? Kind of like still in that groove from being an analyst. And then, 80% of the questions are about doing Pekingology on the Trump administration.
Totally.
Right? Like in the early days, like where does Musk fit in his orbit? Right. And like, who's up, who's down? I'm like, I feel comfortable doing this, but for their system.
Yeah. Is there any aspect of like, just like both of us were born at the wrong time in the sense of just she's kind of boring? Like we had this big bang, right? He comes in, he does all this stuff, but like we're kind of in cruise control on a lot of different dimensions. So the sort of the leadership stuff, even the PLA modernization stuff, the economic reform stuff, it's all kind of like status quo, just like keep drawing out the line. But 40s crazy, 50s crazy, 60s crazy, 70s crazy, 80s crazy, 2000s, some stuff. But like these are like China is more important than it's ever been as a like percentage of like global national power. But from a kind of like elite politics dynamism perspective, like we are at a true nadir, I think.
That is so funny to hear you say that, just because I had a friend and mentor when I was in government who spent a good chunk of his career in the Hu Jintao era, right? And so, when people were committing suicide and Bo Xilai is getting purged and Guo Boxiang is getting purged and Xu Caiho and all these guys who are seen as untouchable. And it's this incredibly volatile and dynamic moment in Chinese politics, right? I remember this colleague saying to me, he's like, Jon, he's like, this is so cool. You get to cover all this stuff now. He's like, I spent most of my career in the Hu Jintao. He's like, I feel like a middle-aged divorcee. Like I gave Hu Jintao the best years of my life. And I don't know. I mean, I think Chinese politics is one of those things. Like at one level, I know what you mean. It can look kind of boring, right? Like especially like when you're doing the medicinal work of plowing through all the speeches, right? And I think you're right. I mean, there are points well taken. There is a lot of continuity, but if you try to see again like how the system looks from the inside, like if you're an official, this is like almost operatic what's been going on in China over the past year, just from the politics perspective. You have, a member of the Central Military, a vice chairman of the Central Military Commission who's just gone missing with no explanation, right? You have people disappearing left and right. You have people getting rotated out of key positions like the organization department, right, which runs all the Purdy personnel. This got lost in the shadow of Liberation Day, just getting swapped out of his position out of nowhere, which is usually not a great sign for one's political health, right? So it is one of those things like you kind of have to squint a little bit to see it,
Yeah.
right? But I think that's part of one of the things that paradox, I think, is what makes following Chinese politics so interesting, right? Because on the surface level, it looks really smooth. But like if you peek under the hood a little bit and think about how it looks to people in the system, it's Game of Thrones, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting. I will say offer too, like I talk to my colleagues and friends who are Russia specialists, and there's always such an interesting juxtaposition if you look at the two political systems, right? Because Putin is obviously also a very personalistic autocrat, but there is, as a casual observer from the outside, very casual observer of Russian politics, there's just a level of chaos in that system and violence that the CCP just doesn't tolerate. Right, like
Yeah.
even watching what happened with Navalny and watching that horrible tragedy, all I could think as a China watcher was they would have squashed this guy like 20 years ago. There's no way they would have let him on social media and posting all this stuff. Like this guy would have disappeared a long time ago. Or even like this
Yeah.
phenomenon of people falling out of windows. Like, yes, people in the CCP get purged and bad things happen, but it's kind of all kept quiet or kept in like the family.
Yeah. And the sort of like we talked about the sort of military adventurism
Yeah.
dynamic, but also like the other parallels of like there aren't like CCP assassination squads in Europe and America
Yeah.
or Tokyo like killing these dissidents on YouTube. The sort of level of obnoxiousness of like democratic subversion.
Yeah.
I think, look, it's there, you have stuff happening in city councils. We had this big mess in the UK Parliament, but I think it's just like an order of magnitude more conservative than what Putin has
Right.
done abroad. So yeah,
Right.
it's kind of
Nobody's getting schwack. Nobody's getting polonium in their tea. But it's an interesting compare and contrast exercise too when you think about U.S. engagement with Russia, because even though the relationship is more fraught and more violent between the U.S. and Russia, there's also this kind of built-in familiarity from the Cold War. Like we've all seen this movie before, and we watched it together, right? So it was striking to me, like, and I thought about this a lot, like when I was at the NSC, the strategic security dialogue that we had with the Russians about really sensitive issues about nuclear weapons and nuclear doctrine, those continued until pretty much the outbreak of the war, right?
Yeah.
Whereas, and my old boss, Kirk Campbell, just had an essay about this in Foreign Affairs. Getting the PLA to talk about anything even remotely adjacent to that is almost like fantastical, right? Like you're kind of chasing a unicorn to have those conversations. And it's interesting because in a lot of ways, we've actually had a much closer relationship with China over the previous 4 decades, right?
Yeah.
But yet, even though we have closer to people ties, we have obviously have the commercial relationship, and even despite all that, when it comes down to those really sensitive geopolitical issues, we can still talk to the Russians in a way that is unimaginable, or not unimaginable, but it's very hard to fathom having those kind of conversations with China.
Yeah, my 2 cents on that is like if you go through the late 50s and early 60s with another country, it's like you kind of get it
Yeah.
about how this shit isn't a joke.
Yeah.
And China has never had a nuclear scare, right?
Yeah.
So like there's a level at which I think their system just like doesn't take this stuff all that seriously. And then I think on the Russia side, like there is an aspect of, oh, we're still talking to the Americans about nukes. That means we're a great power. Whereas China, like, they can get that, like, we're like, we're like the second most, we're like in this, we're in the game. They can feel that from other dimensions than discussing, ADIZ zones.
Yeah. And I think part of it from the Chinese perspective, too, is like, you want to talk to us about nuclear weapons? You talk to the Soviets about nuclear weapons. And how did that turn out for them? Like, what's the angle here? What's the trap? But I think you're right, because I think there is an impulse in some quarters of Washington that I really understand and I'm sympathetic to, that people want to get to some kind of détente. Like they kind of want to, if we're in this kind of more 1950s like moment with China, people say, well, how can we fast forward and get something more to like the 1970s was between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, where it's a more stabilized competition. I could understand that impulse, but I think from the Chinese side, I think without having had that shock or that kind of scare, I think it's going to be very hard emotionally and intellectually for them to get there, right? And I think the things that have gotten the U.S. side on this path, like everybody always goes back to EP3, right, as kind of the touchstone moment, right? And from our side, I think that was kind of an oh shit moment. Like we need to have more meaningful crisis communications or military to military engagement or those sorts of things. And I don't have evidence of this, but I increasingly think that from the Chinese side, they saw that as an effective model of crisis management, right?
Yeah.
They were able to hold on to the pilots, right, for more than 10 days,
Yeah, they
right?
got their
They
apology.
got their apology. It's like, what's the problem here? Going dark is part of what we need to do because we all need, in that system, you need to confer and kind of get your act together. But also as a tactical matter, you could easily see somebody in that system making the case like this was actually quite effective, right?
Yeah.
Going dark enhances and being opaque actually enhances our leverage with the Americans. And the longer we go dark for, the more cautious they're going to be and the more they're going to try to reach out to us.
Yeah. The idea of a accidental World War III starting between the US and China over like jets hitting each other or something just strikes me as like pretty far-fetched. But be curious for your take on that. Because that part of that is like that is the whole line of thinking of why this is important, right? But it just seems like an incredibly low probability event.
Yeah, and I get that perspective, and I appreciate it. But I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I think you're probably right. Like I worry about the risk of some kind of accident, right? Like of some kind of collision. That to me strikes me as totally plausible, right? Or even, I think you could even make a fair case, like it's probably inevitable. Like at some point, something like that, we're going to face this again, right? Just given the way,
Sure.
just given the nature of it, right? Like and how much steel is out in the water and how much is up in the sky. But does that necessarily lead to, some kind of cataclysmic conflict? I think you're right. I think objectively, it's harder to see that. I think part of the challenge for the policy community is that if you're in the seat, right, you want to foreclose that possibility, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the real challenges is that when you're in those jobs, you feel a real responsibility for, okay, like if we think this is a possibility, even if it's not likely, right? How do we stem that possibility? I think the issue is that there's a trade-off for constantly trying to pursue this, right? That you're constantly going after the PLA and you're constantly going after an institution that has little to no interest in talking to you, and that in a crisis, they still got to respond to the political bosses, right? And that's really the crucial channel, right? You're not going to be able to figure it out on your own between the Joint Staff and the Minister of National Defense, who, oh, by the way, is not even in the CMC anymore. It's not even a state counselor, right?
Yeah.
He's like, at this point, it's like talking to a glorified errand boy,
Because basically, in order for like, if we're in a situation pre boats crashing into each other where both sides do not want war to happen, like the argument that a war or a dramatic escalation happens after that is like something in either one of their heads or the sort of domestic temperature political constituently changes such that we go from not wanting a conflict to wanting a conflict or escalating to the point that the other side has to escalate or something. And it doesn't strike me that like the fact that this thing that I think both of us agree is an inevitability, like some Taiwanese troops are going to get like run over. I mean, this is like, it's like kind of unbelievable that this actually hasn't happened in the Philippines yet, that we haven't had deaths. But like, it's just, it's all, everyone's got to price it in at some point. And if you don't want war, if you want to start war, you're going to start it in a more clever way than like running into a boat and then 9 days later, like, starting an invasion, right?
Yeah. And I think there's this presumption sometimes too, that it's going to be the Chinese side that's going to feel the pressure to up the ante, right? Like that, they're going to have to placate the nationalists inside the system. But I actually think, especially in this moment with Xi Jinping so powerful and so dominant in the system, and having been so tough with the United States, I don't really think he necessarily has to cover his political flanks in the way a Hu Jintao would have, right? Or a weaker leader might have to. I mean, that's kind of the paradox is that, yes, Xi is tougher on the United States in some ways, but because he has so much control, he also has more flexibility than a weaker leader might have to kind of fend off those voices and say to the PLA, like, settle down, guys, right? Or whoever else in the system, might perk up, if anybody even chose to perk up in that kind of moment and say like, you're being too weak on the Americans or you're being too weak on Taiwan. It's not. I don't think, and I don't think he has to worry about that necessarily. And I think you've seen that with how they've played the trade war. Like they got very inflammatory with the rhetoric after Liberation Day, and now we're on the path to a summit just 6 months later, right? So it's not like necessarily like they've got total control, and this is their ability to control this is mechanistic. But I don't think they have to worry about it as much as some people on our side think. And it's the same goes true for how this plays out politically in the United States. Right. If there is an accident, yes, people will, be upset about it. But will people really have the appetite or the willingness to go to war, especially in this kind of political moment, right? After what happened after 9/11 and the response that we had that was so over the top and people see as, overblown in so many ways, especially when you're dealing with an adversary that, is so formidable. Right. And I think that's a big rationale for the military modernization. Right. It's not. Yeah, there's an aspect of it of wanting to be prepared for an actual conflict, but I think there's also an element of deterring the United States, right? Yeah, you guys can come into theater, but this is not going to be 1996 Redux, where we actually have real capabilities and we're able to hold your assets in jeopardy. That's one last thing that I would leave you with too, Jordan, is that I've been very struck since I left government with, especially since there's been so much conversation about the national defense strategy. There's a commission, a bipartisan commission that studies each national defense strategy. And if you look at the last one that came out, the last commission report and what it had to say about China in particular, the language in it is very stark, right? It said, the Pentagon for the last two NDSs has said that China is the pacing challenge for the U.S. military, but China's military continues to outpace the United States in a growing number of domains. And there's actually one line in there too where it says they've negated the U.S. military's advantages in the Western Pacific.
Okay, I'm sorry. Whose document is this?
This is a commission, like a separate bipartisan commission that's charged with evaluating the Pentagon's progress against the national defense strategy. Right. So the national defense strategy gets promulgated, and then there's this independent commission. I think it's done through RAND. You can find it online, and I can send it to you for the show notes. That then assesses like, okay, so if these were your objectives, how did we do?
Yeah.
Right? Or how are we doing against the criteria this administration has laid out for the national defense strategy?
I was just going to come back to like India and Pakistan.
Yeah.
Like the fact that they've like figured out how to keep a lid on it. I mean, they do have more practice. Right. Mm-hmm. And there is kind of like a dance, which you've seen a number of times, but that I think as another counterexample to like a crisis leading to World War III, I think is something that folks should price in at some level.
Oh, because you mean India and Pakistan have like grown accustomed to dealing with this and have figured out how to
just like neutral, like you can,
war.
Yeah, like you can do like a thing can happen over 72 hours between two nuclear armed powers. And then like cooler heads can prevail repeatedly, right? It's not like like there is, exactly what you were saying, John. Like these are two very big, scary militaries that if the leaderships don't want to do it, like you can even start escalating, but then like get off the ladder at some point before, cities start getting wiped off the map.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, I always think about like, the history of this when you go back to the 50s, like the Kemoematsu crisis, right? Where I think it was in the second one, if I recall correctly, where the Chinese were shelling Taiwan on alternating days, right? And Mao's telling everybody to settle down and scaring the bejesus out of Khrushchev because it's like, it's fine. It's fine.
Yeah. All right. So maybe we'll call it there.
Yeah, it's been a full 2 hours.
Jon Czin, it's fine. This was a ton of fun. We'll do it again soon. Thanks so much for being part of China Talk.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. Thanks for having me on. This was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.